Welcome to PowerUp podcast, the podcast that seeks to empower and dismantle, giving us the power and confidence to question, deconstruct, rebuild, and expand in life. I'm your host, AmaRouge, voiceover and multidisciplinary artist, well-being advocate, food and book geek with over 14 years of movement-centered experience.
I am your host, Ella Mesmer, artist, choreographer, yogi and coach with a passion for alchemy, creativity, transformation and workplace wellness.
We recognise that we can't dismantle and empower or be empowered without first learning ourselves, diving deeper to unlearn the harmful, restrictive and unprogressive. It's an ongoing practice and journey for us all, which is why we created this podcast.
Our show features guests doing the work to enlighten, deconstruct and power up in their own magical ways.
We're going to be having conversations around the power of healing, transformation, well-being and creativity, and how they feed our personal and collective evolution, how they help us power up.
Nkem Ndefo, MSN CNM RN, is the founder of Lumos Transforms and creator of the Resilience Toolkit, a model that promotes embodied self-awareness and self-regulation in an ecologically sensitive framework and social justice context. She is known for her unique ability to connect with people of all types by holding powerfully healing spaces, weaving complex concepts into accessible narratives and creating synergistic and collaborative learning communities that nourish people's innate capacity for healing, wellness, and connection. Originally licensed as a nurse, midwife, Nkem has extensive postgraduate training in complementary health modalities and emotional therapies, and has worked in settings ranging from large volume hospitals to mobile community clinics. She brings an abundance of experience as a clinician, educator, researcher, and community strategist to innovative programs that address trauma and inequity, build resilience, and shape liberatory change for individuals and organizations across sectors both in her home country, the US, and internationally. She regularly provides trauma-informed subject matter expertise to organizations, initiatives, and governmental agencies. Nkem is particularly interested in working alongside people most impacted by violence and marginalization. Most recently, she led a multi-year embodied diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism initiative for the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services. Like mic drop, floored, just reading your bio already. I feel so blessed to have you in the house. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome, Nkem.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It does sound like a lot when you read it all at once.
It is a lot. It's incredible. And I feel so inspired just listening to all that you've created and journeyed through and experienced so far in your life. And I feel, my head is already like this. I need to just reel myself in for a minute. The first time I was introduced to you and your work and who you are and that you're here in the world doing what you're doing is through a YouTube video by End Pain that you did about 6 years ago. And it was all about releasing pain through TRE, which links to the nervous system. And I have had some TRE last year, which was introduced to me through Ella. And I've also started my training as a TRE certified provider mid last year. And personally, the nervous system is something I'm really intrigued by, how much what we experience is connected to our nervous system and what potentially having a flexible nervous system, quote unquote, looks like for people. And we have a series of episodes where we talked about the nervous system quite a bit. And I remember recently seeing a post on your Instagram expressing that you hate the word dysregulation. And I remember writing to you on that because that just straight away my mind was like, ping, that's a word that I've heard used and associated with the nervous system a lot. I've, talked about having a regulated nervous system, being in dysregulation. And I think I asked you, I think I asked you for a bit more detail, and you offered a really insightful answer. And so this straight away, I was like, oh my gosh, I'd love to invite Nkem on the show. We're doing a whole series on the power of language. This is a massive conversation point. I think broadly and between Ella and myself, even before we made the podcast. So for those who haven't seen the post on your Instagram, would you be able to just share some perspective around what I'm speaking to and your thoughts around that?
Thank you for all of that, the context, your warm words, and the points of connection. So dysregulation is often used to describe somebody whose nervous system is anything but calm. So if someone is stress or trauma activated, we say, oh, that person is dysregulated, DYS, regulated, yeah? And what that implies is that DYS is, in terms of a prefix, means dysfunctional. Something is wrong, something is pathological. And when that's applied and you say this person is stress or trauma activated, and I say that person is in a pathological state, there's something wrong in their state. And it's a way to ask them to settle, to calm, and to become regulated. One, it's pathologizing, just straight off the bat. It's pathologizing. People are having stress and trauma responses to very real material conditions in their lives, whether that is from abuse, whether that is from navigating poverty, systemic poverty, whether that is navigating racism, cis heteropatriarchy, whatever interlocking systems of oppression, that you're not actually having a pathological response, you're having a normal protective response to to harmful situations, to harmful behavior. And so what it does is it's a way of individualizing the response and decontextualizing people from their environments and their networks, and then hoisting the entire responsibility for being regulated on the individual. And there's no responsibility or culpability to the network, the community, the system, the culture, the economics, nothing.
Yes.
And there's no balance at all. And so it's a means of control also. That you should always be well regulated, but we're never going to talk about systems or input that may be influencing you. And it's not to say dysregulation can't happen. There can be a point where I could be very, very safe and very supported and be highly, highly stressed because of what I'm carrying individually. That you could call dysregulation. That I think is fair, right? But in some ways, even if I'm having a response, why am I having a response now? You just need to travel and walk back into history and see, oh, the response I'm having now made sense historically in relation to any of those things, abuse, neglect, violence, any of those things. I had a response in the past and I haven't healed, usually because of the lack of, appropriate healing services and
Yeah.
support. And so now I'm having this in the present, and you're saying, yes, it doesn't match this. I prefer mismatch as a term, saying it's a mismatch to what you're having right now. Pathologize it, but technically you could say dysregulation. I just don't like the term at all. I don't really just don't like the medicalization of, I think, the spectrum of stress and trauma response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, it really does. And the just the power of when we really think about the power of the words that we use. But I really like what you said as well about that it's not always on the individual, and really starting to talk about that. And I had a really interesting conversation last week with Akeim Toussaint, who was also on the show recently, about the word nervous system and the the use of nervous, and whether there's a more helpful word that doesn't tell us to be nervous, that doesn't kind of relate in that way to this system. Like we've been playing with the idea of, could it be a feeling system? So I'd be really interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that. But also, just in general, the way we work. So we're choreographing a show together, and we've been really talking about like how powerful the specificity of words can be, and how we can really choose and really be mindful about the words that we use within our studio setup to create an invitation for well-being. Because I think, like you said, we live in a world where there's often not that support for our healing. That we are, by really being mindful with our language, we're also starting to create that change for ourselves and for our dance company, and to see that change unfolding. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I have thoughts and feelings about it. Starting with, just the word about nervous system, just harking back to that. No, I mean, it means nerves, like, it's colloquially meant to be you are nervous or I feel nervous, but we're talking about the nerves. I find it's reductionist, and I find even in the trauma world there's an over focus on the nervous system, forgetting that the immune system works side by side, right? And it's like we have a Cartesian split, right? We have our heads and our bodies. And so there's been such an emphasis on the mentalization and the intellectualization. So then the pendulum swings. Oh, we're going to talk about the somatic and the body. And we're talking about the nervous system as a physiologic process, not so much the mentation or intellect. Again, when the pendulum swings, you forget the other part. That mentation and intellect is also part of the system. So it's still like problematic. And then what about the immune system? And I think about like new research just several years ago showed that the bones produce a chemical signal involved in the stress response. So
Wow.
really, it's a whole mind-body system.
Yeah.
Right? And so sometimes I just say the mind-body, right? Right? And can we settle the mind-body rather than settle the nervous system? And not to say that we can't pull apart pieces to study them and understand them, but understand at the same time that they are part of a whole. And while there are distinctions, there is continuity and there is overlap. And how do we hold those tensions between making distinctions, right? What is separate and what is a part? So that's my piece about the nervous system. And then about the specificity of language. Yes, I think language it's one of the ways we represent our internal schema, our internal understanding and feeling of being in the world is represented through our language. So it's important to recognize it as a vehicle to understand ourselves. So if we're because what happens with people say we need to be specific or careful around language becomes a carceral approach where we're policing language and we are hyper vigilant about making mistakes. Yeah. So being really cautious, like you need to be specific. Did you use the right word? And how there's such a threat of punishment or exile for using the wrong word. So that's the deeper in the emphasis on specificity. I actually would invite a more curiosity. I'm using this language. What does it represent about how I understand myself, the world, right? What does it tell me? And can I use it as a vehicle to shift my understandings, my conceptions, my way of relating?
Beautiful.
So it's more of a curiosity and investigative rather than, because be careful when we say specific, I mean, it can be, really weaponized. You didn't use the word.
Yeah, I like that. And with curiosity, you can really. We have Tony Stewart is on next, and I just love the kind of poetic mind of Tony, and how we can, that kind of really diving into a word and having curiosity with it. Just, I think it really, then it's like a delightful discovery of actually, no, I'm going to be really mindful and choose this word because this, this is what it means to me, and this is how it might affect how I show up in the world, as well as my being and my life experience. But yeah, it's really lovely. Thank you.
A piece on dysregulation, right? By prompting that, like, I don't like the word, I'm asking for a change of paradigm, right? I'm asking for a change how all of these, especially trauma treatment modalities, these somatic processes are really like perpetuating neoliberal atomization, individualization. And so that's really what I'm questioning is the use. I don't, how are you using the word? And when it opens up and you start to interrogate it, you're like, oh, what is, now I'm looking at how my whole approach is. How am I approaching people? Right? Like it's
Yeah.
often in educational settings in the US, children, and we think of these as trauma informed school settings, educational settings, these kids are dysregulated. We're paying attention to their nervous systems. We're going to be bringing in breathing exercises and yoga and movement. And we think, oh, we're so enlightened. And when I say, if a child is, having this big response, I want to know, is this child safe? Is this child have food in their these are the questions that I'm prompting, right? Like I see it as an alert rather than how do we get the child to be settled and thereby quiet, regulated, and controllable so then we can open up their head, put information, and they, don't disrupt the machine of the, you know, conveyor belt.
Yeah. So what is at the root of it? What is at the base of it for that response to be happening?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, really. Yes. Just yes. Just digesting what you said there about your language and curiosity and specificity, and just that awareness around what specificity can open up. And then also moving from a lens of curiosity and exploration and reflection based on our lexical choices, whether they're conscious or unconscious. I know for me personally, I would say over the last few years, actually, I feel that there's been a lot of language which I don't have yet to articulate what I want to. There's language that I have which doesn't feel like the right fit, maybe to convey what I'm conveying at the time. And so an example is, and I know Ella and I have talked about this quite a lot, people of colour. For me, that doesn't feel like the right fit, and it's not the language that I want to use to describe this group of people. Of course, individually as well, people will have their own definitions of how they want to self-describe and self-identify. But of course, we need to use language in life and in society to communicate. And so, we're always trying to find ways to do that. Sometimes I use the global majority. Sometimes that feels like it fits what I'm trying to articulate, and sometimes it still doesn't. And there are probably people that maybe I'm including in that, for example, that maybe wouldn't include themselves, and vice versa. And, so I can split it down, 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 and down. There are all these layers, of course, to language, and maybe finding the language that fits for each person in particular context. I do feel more aware of the language I'm using, and ironically trying to be more, not necessarily specific, but more accurate with conveying what I want to convey in a moment. And that feels more, and that's feeling increasingly more important to me, I guess, as I'm living more and more life, and as the spaces I'm moving in, and also as I'm doing my own healing as well. And so I just wondered, you've spoken a little bit to it already, But what are your thoughts on our individual and personal and social responsibility in relation to our lexical choices, and whether we interrogate them or not, whether we allow them to just evolve as society evolves? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, they're going to evolve whether we like it or not. That's just the nature of language. And,
Mm.
to your point, we need some kind of shared definitions to be able
Yeah,
to communicate, right? And
yeah,
uh, is there enough common, because often you'll put people down and say, like, sit them together. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? And people are actually quite surprised that the same term means something quite different to
Mm.
different people. And I think that's
yeah,
okay, right? Like, that's what language, you know, if we all had the exact same meaning, we'd all be the same person.
Mm.
So, no, not interested. I like that there's diversity. And with diversity, there's going to be tension. There's going to be
yeah.
misunderstandings. How do we communicate across and through them? Um, I don't know. And also, like, the willingness, like, when there's a desire for real exactness, I often say, what is that desire coming from?
Mm.
Mm,
Is that a desire to control, a desire to be safe? Because usually when I see extremes in any direction, I know trauma is afoot,
Mm.
mm,
right? And that could be overly accepting to overly rigid and rejecting, right? Either of those could be possible. Like, I'm like my little ears, kind of, there's a part of me that perks up, my radar perks up, like, I wonder if there's some
Mm.
trauma. Is it good enough? Are the terms we're using, are they good enough? Not perfect, but good enough. Because the demand for perfection is typically born from trauma.
Mm.
yeah,
So is it good enough? Can I find my representation here? Right? Like, I think about, let's say, even if we name colors, red, a spectrum of all the different reds, is it good enough? Or do I need to say vermilion? Do I need to say crimson? Right? Do I need to have that level of specificity? For some things, yes. Maybe I'm doing printing, right? Right? And I need to really know, or I'm painting and I really need to know the difference between those two pigments, yeah? But for most purposes, is red good enough? Bright red, maybe a little bit, like. And so when I think about the words we call ourselves, whether we say we are Black or African or people of color or POC or BIPOC, or, like, there's so many different terms, and they're going to evolve because they represent our internal knowing and how we identify ourselves. And that's okay. And are there terms that we can agree on that are good enough? Because if we spend all of our time fussing about the terms,
Mhm.
I'm also concerned about what is left, what is
Yeah.
not addressed, right? So we're
yeah,
fussing about terms instead of about the relational connections, instead of about economic systems, instead of about, so, like, how can we have some proportionality to that? It's important, and there are multiple important things.
Mhm.
Because is it language
Well.
for language sake, or is language a vehicle? Yeah. Is it
Mm.
a vehicle for communication, a vehicle for expression, a vehicle for, um, yeah.
Yeah. It's making me think, I mean, of course, this also comes with age and experience, but I think, like, the world we live in now, I feel so much more equipped to understand feelings that I had as a child, that there's kind of those moments of discomfort. So I'm multiple heritage, and those sort of moments where I would be like, I know something's not right, something has been said that's hurt, or, something's just, well, generally, actually, it was very much about words. It really, really was. But, like, to not have had the language or the conversations to allow me to even know what was going on internally. And I'm really finding that, I much prefer the times that we live in now, and how I'm able to and have done that sort of journeying within to be able to express myself, but also, exposure to amazing writers, the kind of the people that I've been able to connect with, which has helped me to understand myself and how beautiful that is, that language, maybe that's reading a poem, maybe that's reading a book, maybe that's hearing someone speaking, but how we can have that moment of like, that's it. That was what that feeling was, and really understand ourselves and what was happening. And I'm feeling like for our listeners, I'm just trying to really think of like, I know if I was listening to this podcast right now, I'd be like, oh, there's something I want to ask you. Yeah, I've been thinking that if I was a listener, I'm sure a listener will be feeling super inspired right now, but also like, where does this wisdom within you come from? Who has inspired you, and whether those sort of moments when you two kind of understood, or did you always just have this knowledge within? What was your journey to get to be the wise being that we are so blessed to be interviewing right now?
I don't know. I want to say something first, though. There is, yes, language is a vehicle, the power of name, to name something in that moment. Again, language as a way of understanding. When it's named, it helps us. Often the implicit becomes explicit, yeah. And there is a
Yeah.
sense of satisfaction of being witnessed, right? That the language is actually having the accurate language is a form of witnessing.
Yes.
And so to be witnessed really is that resonance of witnessing. Because often we'll say someone said, if like there's hurtful words, like the words, right? Is it really the words or is it the hurt?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, is it really the words and so sometimes we'll fuss about the words, but like let's look at like what's happening underneath. What's the relational context? What is the wounding? What is, so sometimes words can be a distraction from, some words can be many different things. It's the truth. Language can be many different things, and to allow it to be those. I don't know. I mean, so and then to your second question, how did I get here? I know it's been a long, winding road, a very long one. Um, born out of intergenerational trauma, my own particular social location, identity, um, has put me at many different margins. And I think when you live in the margins, the ability to code switch is really necessary, right? So to be able to
Yeah.
code switch into to various different dominant identities teaches, has taught me about those identities from like almost a lived experience as well as from the external. And so that fluidity in that. And I'm a very curious person. What is that? And some of my friends will laugh, like, how my mind will jump from one thing to another. And I love and how they relate to each other in a deep dive. I've long maintained like study lists of things that interest me, and then I want
Oh
to
my
learn
gosh, I
more.
love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And just how things connect, right? Like how different things connect. I'm the daughter of a engineer who did fluid mechanics and aeronautic engineering, which is how air and water moves around moving objects. So like complex
Wow.
Oof.
systems fascinate. I see it from him. It's in me. I have two sons who are both also systems thinkers. So something about that piece. And then just saying yes and working with lots of different people alongside different people who have taught me so much. Like I'm an introvert, but I'm an extroverted thinker. So when somebody asks a question, it's taken me a moment to realize that I will go into their experience, like try to
Wow.
empathize and go into their experience. And it causes me to look at what I'm saying or expressing from a particular vantage point that person I imagine is coming from. And so it teaches me more about what I know or what I'm saying. Um,
Amazing.
or expressing. And I will say, I had a student once. He was very wise, this physician, and he worked in a large, like, public health system or not nonprofit here in the US, we would say. But he had a small private practice, and he would see people And occasionally he would send me ones that he couldn't help when I was in a private practice. And I do a number of different practices and approaches that's quite eclectic to
Mm-hmm.
me, with people around trauma, um, just general not wellness, whether that's physical or emotional or some combination, and usually actually quite severe. So he would send me his
Mhm.
most severe, refractive people that weren't getting better. And they started to get better. And he's like, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm using various different approaches." He's like, "No, no, what are you doing?" So he would get me on the phone and he would ask me a series of questions. Because I have a lot of schooling, a lot of training, a lot of experience, but there's also intuition. There's, a lot of things that you bring to bear when you work with people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he would ask me these questions and he helped me understand myself and where I would make decisions, what I was considering and then he would send me typed up notes of the
Wow.
conversation.
Yes, I love
So
him.
great.
Come on, I love this.
Right? Like, what a gift. Like, what a
Yeah.
Yes.
to really understand, like, oh, that's what I was seeing. And I developed the resilience toolkit, and in very soon thereafter, I mean, I'm a tinkerer too. So I'll try things and evaluate. I'm an evaluation nerd. What worked, what didn't, asking people, what do you think?
Mm.
What do you feel? And once it was enough to be named the resilience toolkit, even though it had been in practice in various different forms for a number of years, very soon after people asked for a certification. And I chose to do that instead of writing a book, is to make a certification program. And that has taught me so much because I have students who I'm teaching them to do it's not everything that I do, but the resilience toolkit is a good piece of it. So to have them train them to be able to do it and then hear their questions.
Mm-hmm.
And when I
And
hear their
having that
questions,
reflection.
right, then I'm like, huh. And then what are the decision points? What are the things they're considering? So I love that the gifts of the relational experience of communication to helping understand
Mm-hmm.
more of myself, and I read, and I have chronic illness that has been a huge teacher, probably more, but like I'm the kind of person, I will listen to a podcast or read for just a little bit and then I have to set it down because I actually need to think and reflect and feel into what I just heard or experienced and let it roll around and touch what I already know, and then I can pick it
Mhm.
up and just blow right through.
Mm.
So I don't know, some combination thereof, and this is how I got, and working with, I would say, very diverse people,
Mm-hmm.
lot of different contexts. And so and I like to develop programs rather than just a one-off training, things where I can work with people over time so that you really
Mm.
learn, like, oh, what worked, what didn't, what's happening here, how does change occur? What does it look like?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there you go. That's how I got here, I would say.
Amazing.
Nkem, I wanted to ask you a bit more about the resilience toolkit and maybe a little bit about Lumos Transforms if you want. I remember I attended a workshop and you spoke about the resilience toolkit and actually addressed the name even to start with because of people's ideas around resilience and in the context of a lot of the oppressive systems you named.
One, I chose a very bland name because it's allows it to be a Trojan horse. If it has the name, like the goal of the resilience toolkit is to develop the kind of resilience, right? That is not the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the punitive, individualized resilience that so many people bristle with, and rightfully so. We are interested in what we call an alchemical resilience, which is building flexible strength, right? And increased bandwidth to overcome adversity, to heal, and to change the systems of inequity and adversity into places where we thrive.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of resilience we're looking for. This is a liberatory, it's a healing and liberatory resilience. And if we named it that, right, which is true, right? But I had that kind of name, I would not be, see, law enforcement officers asking, can we take this course?
Yeah.
We would not go into financial institutions saying, can we have this course? So the name is just very bland. And the reason why toolkit is that this idea is people overfocus on the tools, meaning it's the breathing or it's the mindfulness, or as in TRE, it's the therapeutic tremor, which is the body, a mammalian reflex to reset the stress and trauma cycles, right? So that's a mammalian reflex. We overfocus on the tools. You need a kit. The kit is, when do I use it? How do I use it? How do I know it's working? Those are the questions that are so painful. And it's one of the reasons I left TRE. I left TRE because it was an overfocus on the tool and not how do I use it. And I learned in practicing it was over and over, people were asking those kit questions. How do I use it? When do I use it? When do I stop using it? And there's nothing in the framework that answers it. Additionally, that the TRE is the tool decontextualized from the context of people's economic, social, identity, anything. It's totally decontextualized. And so it has a sense of individualizing the responsibility for regulation on the individual. While grammar is fantastic, the way it's used is often in a cathartic way. So it's like it was breaking free of that and saying, how Resilience Toolkit, we ask 5 guiding questions. And those 5 guiding questions help people do a number of things. The first question is asking, what is my stress or trauma response right now? And that asking that question of ourselves helps us understand our responses better, helps us understand our interiority better. And then the second question is, how do I know that that's my response? That asks us to drop even further to develop with a quality of what's called interoception, the ability to know what's happening inside of my own body. And we have a poverty of language, speaking of language, around the internal experience because we don't witness one another. We live in a culture that is, and an economic system that is spread around the globe, that is, humans are only in service of production, performance, and consumption. There's not this, space for reflection and connection, right? So, and then the third guiding question is my response useful for me right now? Which teaches us to develop discernment, right, of ourselves in relation to our context. Is my response helping me survive right now? So I am now not pathologizing my response. I am, equalizing the responsibility with my environment, right? And this idea of this discernment, so many of us with marginalized identities are acculturated, trained to decenter our own comfort and our own needs in service of those with dominant identities. And so this is a resituating of authority and right to our own authentic needs, just in that question being asked over and over again. Then the question is, what tool will I use and how do I know it works? I can't say there are so many different practices out there, but very rarely, or I should say usually, it's use this breathing technique, use this technique. Nobody asks you, is this working for you?
Yeah, right.
How do you know?
Yeah. What's the measure?
Right? The authority is in the breathe, like, this is good. And if you can't do it, you're bad. You need to learn.
Yeah.
Like it just makes no sense to me. Well, here again, storing internal authority, which is quite radical again for those of us who have marginalized identities, to say, no, this is not working for me. And how do I know? And then being able to stop and do something else, which is a flexibility, right? That we lose in trauma responses where we become very rigid. Here we're practicing this flexibility in service of our own well-being, and not an individualized well-being, but as we begin to settle in our responses, it becomes less of me and more of we.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that is that idea of the resilience toolkit, when you hear the name, you think, oh, this is just a little thing. But when you hear all of that, oh no, this is what's happening. And then when we practice it together in community, it's so beautiful to watch the development of the self-understanding, the other understanding of each other, and the power of um, acting in our own best self-interest together. So it's been a joy, and and I use it, like if I'm doing specific anti-racism work, and it might be in an organization or a community, and there's so much trauma around racism and privilege on all sides, that if you think you're going to change your policies, your procedures, your practices without addressing the trauma, you're just going to end up with another system of coercion and control. And so when we set or front load the resilience toolkit as a skill building in advance, people are better able to enter into those conversations with grace and flexibility and spaciousness and connection to themselves and each other. So I love, it's been really joyful to both practice it, to teach it, and to bring it into spaces and watch people, what they do with it. It's very exciting to me.
How long did that process take you, Nkem, from conceiving the resilience toolkit to, I guess, kind of end point of it? Or is it continuously evolving and being added to?
It's continuously evolving. I can't imagine, you know, so I mean, again, I like to tinker and experiment. And it was I started with TRE, but as opposed to just coming and doing one-off workshops, I'm doing programs with communities over time, and I'm seeing what's working and what's not. I'm hearing the same questions over and over. I'm like, there's a question that's being asked over. I've heard it multiple times. There's something this model is
Yeah.
missing. So I'm willing, where do I need to stretch? What needs to adapt so that people can see themselves? And so and also many people they don't just need a tool, they need a schema, they need a framework, or they need help in developing their own to use it, right? Or adapting it to an existing schema. So it's not enough to have these floating tools. Um, and so it was in that process. It formally was named in 2017, was when I formally named it the Resilience Toolkit, but it was in process. And then when I developed the certification program, I said, okay, it'll take me maybe 2 months. It was about 20 to 30 hours a week for 6 months
Wow.
as I did deep dive into research to pull all this, things that I had known, but to really provide the solid ground. And we don't, for those people who know a lot about the nervous system, they'll use either the triune brain or the idea of the polyvagal system as a grounding for your entire approach, and they have limitations. And so in the toolkit, we use multiple different models, knowing each has strengths and each has limitations and each has biases. And a model is only as good as it helps someone understand themselves. That's the point of it. So we can bring forward different models, but as the science evolves, as our understandings evolve, the models evolve. And thank God, I hope the toolkit continues to evolve. As we work with people, if it's not working for them, how do we, that's the flexibility that's built into it, where it has a definite scaffolding and a clear aim. But the means by which we get there may need to, evolve if they are not. Um, and so I love the creativity in our community of practice of folks who are certified. So as we meet regularly, somebody was saying, I'm working with someone in Afghanistan. We don't have enough bandwidth even for a Skype call. I mean, even, excuse me, a WhatsApp. So we are doing WhatsApp by chat. So we're
Wow.
facilitating by chat. So what does that need to look like to change?
Yeah.
Right? How does it look different with children? How might it look different when there's different types of neurodiversity? And so I'm actually excited by, we've had someone in the certification program who's a voice hearer, right? Which is also known as schizophrenia. How do you adapt what needs, so I'm like endlessly fascinated by what the potential is here, with this. So
Amazing.
This is incredible. Thank you so much for creating this. Even just knowing that this exists is, I mean, I don't have the language. But yeah.
yeah, and that what is that moment, right, when we don't have language and that we can be okay with that? Like, what I've taken to when I facilitate, I'll often offer moments of reflection. And I now, for a while, have been saying at this moment of reflection, typically people say, "What are you thinking?" And then maybe jot some notes down. I say, maybe you want to feel, maybe you want to draw, maybe you need to, it's a gesture, maybe
Oh,
there's movement, larger movement, maybe you need to sing or make music. What is the way in which you understand through reflection?
I love
Which, harkens back. I'm also trained as a homeopath in a method called the sensation method. And this idea of the sensation method is below language, there is a core gesture that is the sensation of somebody's, right, their essence. And it is there in resonance that you choose the homeopathic remedy. So you'll ask question after question until the person is just like, and they only have a gesture, and you're like, language has failed. Now we are here.
I love that. Oh my gosh, and there's so much truth in that. It's so down to like the human. It's so down to the human level, which just is brilliant.
I love it. I love it. And it feels, I love how it connects back to dance and movement. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Pleasure, really, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. You can connect to us and our guests via the links in each episode's show notes. Before you go, we invite you to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the goodness to come. And if you enjoyed today, perhaps tell a friend to tell a friend. We are always grateful for you, our listeners, for our fabulous guests, and to everyone who has contributed to and been a part of our journey here.
Our music is by Tomo Carter. Everything else is brought to you by us, the PowerUp Power Team.
I'm Ella Mesmer.
I am AmaRouge.
And we are PowerUp
Podcast.